Hi, this is History with me, Dan. Connecticut is one of the original 13 states of the United States. It should be no surprise the state has some of the nation's oldest municipalities. But in this video, I'm not going to talk about the oldest. Instead, I'm going to list the state's 10 newest towns. You might have heard that Connecticut has 169 towns. Technically, 149 of them have town governments, while 19 of them are incorporated as cities, and one is actually a consolidated borough town. But when they are referred to as a group, they are commonly called 169 towns. This focus on towns as the basic local unit for dividing up the state comes from the fact that Connecticut is in New England, which was settled in the 1600s by Puritans from Old England. These settlers followed an ideal of local autonomy that centered on the town meeting house, which served as both a house of worship and a venue for the town meeting form of government. The earliest settled towns usually started out covering a much larger area than they do today. As multiple population centers sprang up within a town, they would form their own parish with its own meeting house. These new parishes could then form the basis for creating a new town. For instance, the town of Wethersfield, which was settled in 1634, would eventually have the so-called daughter towns of Glastonbury, Rocky Hill, and Newington. Glastonbury separated from Wethersfield as early as 1693 because of the difficulty of having to cross the Connecticut River to attend services at the meeting house on the Sabbath. 110 years later, the southeast corner of Glastonbury became part of the new town of Marlborough, which was established by taking land from the older towns of Glastonbury, Colchester, and Hebron. Wethersfield itself also experienced further subdivision. The district of Stepney, in the southern part of town, was established as a separate congregational parish with its own meeting house in the 1720s. But it did not become a new town, which was named Rocky Hill, until 1843. Several decades after that, the western part of Wethersfield would separate to become the town of Newington, which I'll talk about more shortly. From early on, the Connecticut colony was also divided into counties. But the system of dividing up a state primarily by counties, which is the norm outside New England, never displaced the primacy of towns as the basic local unit in Connecticut. In fact, the state abolished almost all of the functions of county government back in 1960. Getting back to towns, multiple new ones were established in every single decade from the 1630s through the 1870s. Then the pace slowed down, with one town added in the 1880s and one in the 1920s, to reach the current number of 169. So what were the last 10 new towns created in Connecticut? When were they incorporated? And what towns did they separate from? I should mention that my list is derived from a web page called Connecticut Towns in the Order of Their Establishment with the Origins of Their Names, which is at the ct.gov website under the Office of the Secretary of the State. So that's the introduction. Now let's get on to the list. The first town on my list is in the northwest part of the state. At number 10 is the town of North Canaan, incorporated in 1858. I'm not sure why it's listed as the 160th town to be established in Connecticut on that ct.gov list, where it has an incorporation date of May 1858, when the next oldest town, the 159th on the list, East Granby, is listed as June 1858, a month later. But anyway, North Canaan is located just south of the Massachusetts border between Salisbury and Norfolk. It was originally part of the town just to the south, Canaan, which was incorporated way back in 1739. Perhaps it's not surprising that the original larger town of Canaan would eventually divide into northern and southern halves. The large Canaan Mountain in the center of town separated the villages of Canaan and East Canaan in the north from South Canaan and Falls Village in the south. The original Congregational Meeting House was located in South Canaan, but in 1767, a separate ecclesiastical society was established in the north at East Canaan. It would be another 90 years, however, until North Canaan formally separated as a new town. An odd consequence of the division is that the village called Canaan ended up being the main population center of the town of North Canaan, while the main center of the town of Canaan is Falls Village. Sometimes that whole town is called Falls Village. Town number 9 on our list shares a lake with the town just to its north. Connecticut's 161st town is Morris, which was incorporated in June of 1859 and named for James Morris, a prominent resident. Like North Canaan, Morris is in Litchfield County. In fact, it originally was part of the town of Litchfield. It was first settled by Europeans in the 1720s as Litchfield's South Farms District. It formed its own congregational parish in 1767 and, as was the case with North Canaan, it took about 90 years after that before the establishment of a separate town of Morris. Interestingly, the area just to the east of Morris, originally called Southeast Farms and later the village of Northfield, formed its own congregational society in the 1790s, but unlike Morris, it remains part of the town of Litchfield today. The 8th youngest town and the 162nd to be established in Connecticut is in the eastern part of the state. It's Sprague, which was incorporated in May of 1861, just as the Civil War was getting started. Located north of Norwich in New London County, Sprague is the first town on our list to be created from parts of 2 other towns, Lisbon to the east and Franklin to the west. Like Morris, the town was named for a person, in this case William Sprague, an industrialist and politician who served as governor of Rhode Island and United States Senator. Shortly before his death in 1858, Sprague took an interest in an area along the Shetucket River as a site for industrial development. He purchased 300 acres there, and soon his nephews, William and Amasa, erected a textile mill, the Baltic Cotton Mill. The mill village of Baltic thus grew up in the area, eventually expanding to both sides of the Shetucket River. This meant that parts of the village were in 2 towns because the Shetucket divided Franklin and Lisbon. To make things more convenient, the mill owners decided to petition the state to create a new town, centered on the village of Baltic and named for the mill's founder, Sprague. Incidentally, the new town of Sprague included a much older settlement that had been part of Lisbon. This was the village of Hanover, which had formed its own congregational church society back in the 1760s. Our next town is in Middlesex County, and it's home to the famous Lyman Orchards. The 7th youngest town and the 163rd to be established in Connecticut is Middlefield, incorporated in June of 1866. by which time the Civil War had ended. The area in the southwest part of Middletown was settled by English colonists as early as the year 1700 and was known as Middlefield by 1744, when its Congregational Society was organized. As I said, this rural section of Middletown separated to become its own town in 1866. Next up, the sixth youngest town and the 164th to be incorporated was Plainville in July of 1869. Plainville was originally part of the town of Farmington to the north, which is one of Connecticut's oldest towns, being settled by colonists in 1640. Parts of this mother town had already been partitioned off to form the various towns mentioned on the Farmington Town Seal. In the 18th century, Southington had separated in 1779, followed by Berlin and Bristol in 1785. Later, Burlington was partitioned off from Bristol in 1806, and New Britain from Berlin in 1850. Meanwhile, the last two towns to split directly from Farmington were Avon in 1830, and lastly, Plainville in 1869. Plainville was in the south of the remaining part of Farmington. In the northwest part of Farmington is Unionville, which remains part of the town of Farmington to this day. Plainville, which was originally called the Great Plain, did not have its own congregational church until 1840. A decade later, the congregation dedicated its meeting house, designed by the great New Haven architect Henry Austin. The fifth youngest town is one of two towns on our list that are in the Naugatuck River Valley in New Haven County. This was an area that experienced a great deal of industrial development in the 19th century, and this town was no exception to that. The 165th town in Connecticut was Beacon Falls, incorporated in 1871. Named for Beacon Hill, which had a waterfall, the community of Beacon Falls grew up on both sides of the Naugatuck River. To create the new town in June of 1871, land was taken from all four of the surrounding towns: Naugatuck to the north, Bethany to the east, Oxford to the west, and Seymour to the south. The part taken from the town of Oxford included the settlement at Pines Bridge, where a bridge crossed the Naugatuck River. Town number 4 is one I mentioned earlier in this video, Newington, which separated from Wethersfield in July of 1871. Newington had been the western section of town. Glastonbury, on the east side of the Connecticut River, had already been split off in 1693, and Rocky Hill, just south of Wethersfield, had become a town in 1843. Another section of Wethersfield, called Griswoldville, had an honorary mayor for many years, but remains a neighborhood of the town of Wethersfield. The next two towns on our list were named for people, and like Sprague, both of these men were involved in industry. The first was the famous clockmaker Seth Thomas, who gave his name to the third town on our list, Thomaston, which was Connecticut's 167th town, incorporated in July 1875. This returns us to Litchfield County again, where Thomaston is just southeast from number 9 on our list, the town of Morris. The area that was to become the town of Thomaston was part of the Mattatuck Plantation, purchased from Native Americans by Puritans from Farmington. Mattituck was renamed Waterbury when it was admitted to the Connecticut colony as a town in 1686. The future Thomaston was part of a parish in Waterbury called Northbury, which joined with another parish called Westbury in 1780 to form the town of Watertown. Northbury then separated from Watertown in 1795 to form the town of Plymouth. This town included the central area of Plymouth Hill and the village of Terryville to the east, both of which are still part of the town of Plymouth. It also included the settlement at Plymouth Hollow to the west. Terryville was named for the inventor and clockmaker Eli Terry, who had settled there in the 1790s. Seth Thomas initially worked for Terry before going into business for himself at Plymouth Hollow in 1813. He eventually incorporated the Seth Thomas Clock Company in 1853. Collectors of Seth Thomas clocks can date them based on their labels. If the label indicates Plymouth Hollow, then it can be dated to before 1865. It was then that Plymouth Hollow was renamed Thomaston, although another decade would pass before Thomaston formally separated from Plymouth to become its own town. Number 2 on our list, Connecticut's 168th town, is Ansonia, incorporated in April 1889. This town returns us to the Naugatuck River Valley in New Haven County, south of Beacon Falls, which was number 5 on our list. As was the case with Sprague, Ansonia was founded by an industrialist who thought it would be a good place to establish his factories, in this case copper and brass mills. But unlike Sprague, Ansonia would derive its name not from a surname, but from a first name, that of Anson Green Phelps, who was born in Simsbury, Connecticut in 1781 and had become a successful merchant in New York. Phelps established Ansonia along the east bank of the Naugatuck River in the town of Derby. He was initially drawn to the area to invest in the town's industrial section called Birmingham, which is now the center of the city of Derby. Ansonia grew to become bigger than Birmingham. It became a borough within Derby in 1864 and its own town in 1889. Ansonia's seal displays 2 dates, 1844, when it was first founded, and 1893, when it was first incorporated as a city. When Ansonia separated to form its own town, it took with it some of the oldest parts of Derby to have been settled by English Puritans in the 17th century. This includes the historic district along Elm Street, which still has homes built in the 18th century, including the General David Humphreys House. He was a literary figure, politician, and entrepreneur who had been an aide to George Washington during the Revolutionary War. His birthplace in Ansonia is now a museum operated by the Derby Historical Society. So now I've listed 9 out of the 10 youngest municipalities in Connecticut. These cities and towns cover a range of population size. 6 of them have less than 10,000 people, ranging from Morris with 2,267 through Sprague, North Canaan, Middlefield, and Beacon Falls, up to Thomaston at 7,500. Then there's a jump to 5 digits. Plainville has 17,500, which is 10,000 more than Thomaston, and Ansonia has close to 19,000. Then there's another big jump up to Newington, which has over 30,000. The last town on our list, though, is by far the largest, with a population of 55,000. Number 1 on our list, and the 169th and final town in Connecticut, is West Haven, which was incorporated as a town in 1921, over 30 years after the previous new town, Ansonia. West Haven became a city in 1961, making it the state's youngest city as well as its youngest town. West Haven brings us again to New Haven County, this time on the shoreline, where it is southwest of the city of New Haven. Nearby are East Haven and North Haven, which, like West Haven, started out as parts of New Haven. East Haven and North Haven became separate towns in the 1700s, but West Haven remained part of New Haven until 1822, when the communities of North Milford and West Haven joined to form the town of Orange. Although it was often discussed over the years, it took another century before West Haven finally separated from the town of Orange. West Haven may be Connecticut's youngest town, but European settlement in the area dates back to 1648, and West Haven became a separate parish within New Haven in 1719. The image on the city's seal relates to the Revolutionary War. It depicts Thomas Painter, a teenage militiaman, sighting approaching British ships off Savin Rock in 1779. I hope you enjoyed this video about the 10 youngest towns in Connecticut. If you want me to make more videos like this, please let me know in the comments. Also, hit the like button and the subscribe button. And thank you for watching.